Welcome, everyone. You have on stage in front of you three lucky men who have found ways of making a living by going on holiday in our different ways. But I think our three careers, which we'll explore over the next hour, show the many different ways, in a sense, that you can make a living and hopefully create some good writing from doing what most people think of as one of life's greatest pleasures, the business of travel writing. And over the next hour, we will consider how the three of us have made a living in this world, how we go about writing travel books, but particularly what's the place of travel writing in the world today, in a world where everyone travels, everyone is a photographer, and in many ways, the world has become a suburb, as is often said. Though perhaps I should just start by reading one of my favorite quotes. This is by Jonathan Rayburn. "Old travelers grumpily complain that travel is now dead and the world is a suburb. They are quite wrong. Lulled by familiar resemblances between all the unimportant things, they miss the brute differences in everything of importance." So those are ideas that we will be exploring. I think there could be a worse way to start than to talk a little bit about where travel writing has come from before we look at where it's going. And travel writing, I think, is one of the few truly universal forms. The narrative of a journey, whether as fiction or non-fiction, or even as epic and myth, is the most ancient form of literature in existence. From the epic of Gilgamesh and the wanderings of Gilgamesh across ancient Mesopotamia, the wanderings of the patriarchs of the Old Testament, through the wanderings of the Pandava brothers in the Mahabharata. This is a genre which has sprung up in every continent. The travel writings of Li Po, and Fa Hessian and Huan Sang, the last two giving us one of the first really clear snapshots of what it was like to live in ancient India at the time of the Hindu revival and Buddhist decline. The writings of the great Arab travelers like Ibn Jubayr, Ibn Battuta, traveling across the world from the Maghreb through the Islamic world, reaching India and so on. Marco Polo, setting off from Venice, heading towards Kubla Khan and Xanadu. And this is not true, of course, of the novel. The novel has a specific, while it's now a universal form, it had a specific birth in 18th century Europe. And the only comparable form, I think, is probably epic poetry, which has sprung up in every culture of the world, and obviously speaks to something deeply universal and human. Travel writing has gone through many different phases. During the colonial period, travelers were often imperial spies, thinking of the works of Alexander Bukhara Burns, as he was known, who, while on a mission for Victorian intelligence and the East India Company, was pretending to be a traveler while collecting information about Central Asia. Some of the great travelers in Africa were sending reports back to the Foreign Office at the same time. Then you get the great wave of literary travel writing that takes place in the 1920s and 30s with writers like Evelyn Waugh and Robert Byron and Peter Fleming, writing very much in a white man's world at a time of the peak of imperial confidence before the Second World War, often writing extremely Eurocentric narratives. But this was already a time when the world had been largely explored, and travel writing was no longer about informing people about unmapped quarters of the globe, and was becoming more about entertaining the reader with a well-written literary narrative. And then in the 1980s, Alexander, being one of the great stars of this period, another revival of travel writing with writers such as Paul Theroux, whose Great Railway Bazaar in 1975 sold 1.5 million copies, and was translated into 100 languages across the globe, and in many ways started, well, certainly the wave of travel writing that created my career, leaving universities in the late 80s. And this time, travel writing again was a much more universal thing. You began to have writers from many different parts of the world, many from India. Vikram Seth wrote from Heaven's Lake. Amitav Ghosh wrote in an antique land. Pico Iyer wrote Video Night in Kathmandu. And these were very much post-colonial, sometimes post-modern narratives, very much aware of of travel writing's largely white, Anglo-centric, often very English past, but spinning it anew in a quite different form. Today, we have, of course, the rise of travel websites, travel blogs, and the whole online world of travel writing. So travel writing has been many different things at many different parts, in many different parts of the world at many different times. And we've all led slightly different careers as travel writers. But I'm going to start first with Alexander, who was a great inspiration to me when I was starting off in the late 80s. Alexander had that most enviable of jobs, a professional travel writer on the Observer. And his job was to do what most people would dream to do maybe once a year, if they were lucky, to go off to some really exotic place on an expenses budget and make a living by writing about it. And then went on to write famous books such as Beyond the Blue Horizon, and most famous in this country, and still a perennial bestseller, Chasing the Monsoon. So Alexander, tell me, how did you first get into travel writing, and did you consciously think of yourself as a travel writer?
No, I came into it entirely by accident. I mean, you wrote your first bestseller when you stood at school. I came into travel writing. I wrote my first book at the age of 50, and I came in by accident, really. I worked at the Observer, and they had an idea for a book which they were going to call Great Rivers of the World. And I was asked to commission the pieces. So I just sent my favorite writers off down various routes. Bruce Chapman did the Volga, Norman Lewis did the Nile, Paul Theroux did the Yangtze, and I kept the best river for myself, which was the Irrawaddy. I sailed from Rangoon, from Mandalay down to Rangoon, and wrote my first serious travel piece. And I was aware that
this was for a book, or is for a travel?
This is for a collection published in the Observer, which then became a book. It was very strange. I suddenly saw myself as a travel writer, and I was viewing the world through almost a third eye. It was quite strange. I was taking note of things that I wouldn't normally have taken. I mean, somebody will gesture. You will hear somebody say something, a single word, a look, and it leads into all kinds of things.
Keep it central. You're drifting on and off.
Oh, I'm sorry. And it led to all kinds of things. So yes, I came to it by accident, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm, as William said, we're the lucky ones. I mean, we get out of bed and do something that we love, and we get paid for it. It's amazing. And the nice thing about doing a book is the lovely thing about coming back to Mumbai or Bombay is the number of people who've read the book and come up to me and said so. And that's one of the loveliest things about writing. When you publish a book, you have no idea what people are going to say. And I was particularly nervous about India. I mean, I was originally an Australian. What the hell is an Australian doing writing about the Indian monsoon? And I was very concerned about the reception in India. What would the Indians say? How would they respond? In fact, you've responded wonderfully. And this 3 days in Bombay have been fantastically good for my self-esteem. So thank you all very much.
When I tweeted that I was on this panel with Alexander Frater, Jonathan Clements, this wave of tweets came back saying, "I love Chasing the Monsoon," all from Indian Twitter handles, so that you have a huge audience here, sir. So your first, Chasing the Monsoon, was your first or your second travel book? Blue Horizon was the first?
No, the first travel book was, I have a thing about aeroplanes, and my first travel book was following the old the old Imperial Airways route. Imperial it has now become BA, but originally called Imperial Airways with slightly dodgy political overtones. But they flew these extraordinary old aeroplanes all the way from London to Brisbane in Australia, and it was the world's longest scheduled flight. It took 2 weeks. They stopped at 40 different places. They put up every night in really good hotels, and of course it was for the super rich. But I managed, of the 40 places, I managed to get to all but one of the 40 places, and that was. That was problematical. But
what was the one that got away?
The one that got away was in Iraq. It was a desert fort where the planes had stopped, literally in the middle of the desert, and they were put up in an English country house, really, and they had things like mutton stew and beef soup and all the rest of it. But when I tried to get there, I found that it was off limits, and it was off limits because Saddam Hussein was making poison gas on that site. So I wasn't allowed in, and I wasn't particularly interested in going, to be honest.
And after that, Chasing the Monsoon, which year was this? 86, 87? No.
Chasing the Monsoon, God, yes, 87, I think, yeah.
Yeah. I remember when it came out, there was a huge wave of wonderful reviews and...
Oh, good,
yeah.
okay. I'm not quite sure what to say, really. I mean, I've done this book, and it's strange when you publish a book. I mean, your whole life. It took 2.5 years to write the thing. It took me 3 months to write the first paragraph, because that's the trickiest part of all, just getting into the book. But my late wife called it finding the key to the door, and she'd say, "Have you found the key yet, darling?" And I'd say, "No." But after 3 months, I found the key, and then it just went beautifully, and gave me a great deal of pleasure.
And talk a little bit about the idea behind it, Chasing the Monsoon.
I went up down the Karakoram, or rather up the Karakoram highway before it was actually finished, and it went to Kashgar in China. Well,
the most spectacular land journey I've ever been on.
You've done that too.
That was amazing. Yeah.
Well, I did it before the road was completely finished, and it was being built by Chinese convicts. And the road was very, very rough. And the convicts had this sort of trick. The road ran across a cliff edge. And below at the bottom of the cliff, there were smashed up vehicles which had been pushed there by the Chinese with their bulldozers. And they had a go at us, but my driver was wise to this, and we got away. But anyway, when I got back to England, I suddenly found that I had no feeling in my hands, then no feeling in my feet, and then no feeling up to my knees. And I thought, I've got MS. And I went to see my doctor, and he said, this looks quite serious. Anyway, so I went to hospital for 2 weeks, and it was just whiplash, that's all. But in the hospital, I met an Indian couple. He was there because he had migraines, and he was seeing a specialist. And his beautiful wife was in the waiting room, waiting for him. And I started waiting for my appointment. We got chatting. And she mentioned the monsoon, and then he came out and joined us, and she said, "We were just talking about the monsoon," and he said, "Ah, yes, it's wonderful, wonderful time of year." And then he said something about it moving up India. In other words, it was a traveling phenomenon. I hadn't actually realized this, and then he said that it came ashore at Trivandrum, and then moved all the way up India at approximately 10 miles an hour. To Cherrapunji in Meghalaya, and I suddenly thought, and I said to him, could you follow it? Could you follow the monsoon? And he said, "God, that's an idea. Why not?" And so it went from there. And after my whiplash thing, I'd come home from hospital, and I was really depressed, very, very down. And I suddenly thought, going to India to chase the monsoon, what an amazing thing to do. And that's how it started.
One element of surprise is that there is a major cultural difference between Britain and India in the attitude to rain. Where I grew up, certainly in Scotland, rain was something, a gloomy thing. It drizzles. It's not rain as is known here. It's a permanent presence throughout half the year, in a very sort of almost a light mist. And it's a grey sky. You can't go outside, or if you do, you just get wet and miserable. And it's cold. While here, obviously in India, the monsoon is a joyous and sexy thing. In miniatures, it's women on pahari battlements looking out over landscapes of lightning flashes and peacocks with lovers on different sides of the valley. There's a whole literature and a whole world of song associated, and indeed in Bollywood, with wet saris and all the rest of it. But you come from Britain. Why would you want to spend... I mean, I can't think of anything nicer than going through India, but it's the one time of year I wouldn't come to India. In fact, it is because of my cultural upbringing and the way I associate rain with gloom and misery. It's the one time of year that actually I try and keep away from India. And the idea of traveling through this country for 3 months is at that time of year, it fills me with horror. Flooded roads, delayed planes, everything that you want to avoid really in travel.
Well, I loved it so much that I actually came back. After the book came out, the BBC got in touch and said, would you like to do a documentary, Chasing the Monsoon? I said, yeah, any excuse, any excuse. And so that was arranged, and we set off with a BBC film crew to Trivandrum, and the monsoon didn't come. And the director, BBC director, was going crazy. He said that my damn film crew is sitting down there on the bloody beach. Do you know how much this is costing me? And I said, well, I can guess. And then I had an idea, and I said, let's go and see the local fire brigade. So we went to see the chap who ran the Trivandrum Fire Brigade, and we explained who we were and what we were doing. And I said, could you do, with your hoses, could you do monsoon rain? And he thought for a moment, and he said, yeah, we could try. Well, anyway, they agreed, and so we set off up India with the minivan, the BBC minivan, followed by a big red fire brigade. And these blokes are absolutely amazing. It was the drenchiest, wettest, drippiest rain you could imagine. Not only that, they could do rainbows. Not only that, they could actually do double rainbows, and they became absolute experts. And when the problem was...
Never believe anything you see on television ever again.
No. And we could have got into trouble with because it was broadcast on ABC in the States, and as you said, they check everything. Everything has to be correct. And the ABC demanded that I have to give them a book of reference, a reference book, which would prove the points I was making. So I just gave them Chasing the Monsoon, and that seemed to be absolutely fine. But the point is, when the actual monsoon rain arrived, it was, by comparison with my firemen, it was pathetic.
Alexander, would you like to make a quick reading from Chasing the Monsoon?
This is the monsoon arriving in Cochin.
And this time it did actually arrive.
It did arrive. No, this is not with the film crew. This is with just me and my pen and my notebook. At 1 p.m., the serious cloud build-up started. 2 hours, 50 minutes later, racing cumulus extinguished the sun and left everything washed in an inky violet light. At 4:50, announced by deafening ground-level thunderclaps, the monsoon finally rode into Cochin. The cloud base blew through the trees like smoke. Rain foamed on the hotel's harborside lawn and produced a bank of hanging mist opaque as hill fog. In the coffee shop, the waiters rushed to the windows, clapping and yelling, their customers forgotten. One emerging from the kitchen bearing a teapot, destined for the Indian Spices Board, the conference room where it was rumoured executives of the Indian Spices Board sat in closed session, glimpsed the magnificent spectacle outside, banged the teapot down on my table, and ran to join them, crying, "Ho, ho, ho!" Heaving a door open, I stepped outside. Soaked to the skin within seconds, I felt a wonderful sense of flooding warmth and invigoration. It was indubitably a little bit like being born again. Raindrops rang like coins on the flagstone path, and the air was filled with fusillades of crimson flowers from the black flamboyant trees. They went arcing by like tracer, and raked by an especially mean burst. I can testify that flamboyant blossoms hitting you in the eye at 60 kilometers an hour cause pain and temporary loss of vision. At Fort Cochin, they were ringing the bells at St. Francis Church. In the dark harbour, small boats ran for home. Waves bursting over the scalloped seawall were suffused curiously with pink light. The jetty set under a small wooden gazebo vanished beneath heavy surf. Orange tiles cladding the gazebo's steeply pitched roof began to tremble until, like clay pigeons being sprung, they went whirling off into the murk one by one. Then, from the corner of an eye still watering from the flower strike, I witnessed an astonishing scene. Two straining waiters held the coffee shop door open while a party of men and women filed into the storm. The men wore button-down shirts and smart business suits, the women best quality silk saris and high-heeled shoes. As they emerged, they opened their arms and lifted their faces to the rain. The Spices Board had come out to greet the monsoon. They made for the jetty, strolling, laughing out loud, calling, revolving slowly in a kind of dreamlike gavotte. In the gazebo, they stood knee-deep in seething water, while the wind blew spiraling flumes of rain up over the peak of the disintegrating roof. The flumes united under a fountainhead, which, along with the tiles, kept getting snatched away. Buffeted by the gusts, unbalanced by the waves, the Spices Board executives clung to each other with water in their eyes and looks of sublime happiness on their faces. A young woman in a soaked and flapping gold-colored sari laughed at me and clapped her hands. "Paradise will be like this," she shouted.
Jonathan, you've also made a lifetime of out of following your dreams, writing about the parts of the world that interest you most. But you've led a different life. Alexander, based in a newspaper, occasionally making a foray into a big project like a book or a documentary. But you've written a whole succession of books and television exercises, series, and so on. Describe your travel career.
Well, I hate traveling. I absolutely hate it. I'm very happy to live somewhere for a prolonged period of time. I just hate going there, and I hate being out of my depth, and I hate all the things that I would assume a travel writer would enjoy. And I kind of backed into it by accident. I'm a historian, and I'm writing, books about things that happened long ago in the past. And because the cost of photography was so expensive, I started going to these places myself, and I really started to enjoy the sense of history happening in context, of being able to look, to visit a place where something terrible had happened 300 years before, or where something wonderful had happened 1,000 years before, and to see what was still the same, or what was different, which is, as far as I'm concerned, what makes history writing interesting anyway. And then, as I became advanced in years, television came calling. We just finished filming the third season of a show called Rude Awakening for National Geographic, which is about an idiot who travels around China trying to find out about stuff and getting into terrible trouble. I play the idiot.
I should interject here and just point out that while he may pretend to be an idiot, he speaks perfect Chinese and perfect Japanese, so can't be entirely lacking.
Well, the thing is that I may be performing the role of an idiot. I play an idiot on television. But one of the reasons they came to me is that Alexander mentions this monsoon fakery, which is disgusting. I'm absolutely aghast at that. National Geographic have an entire unit in Washington, D.C., whose job, and then they used to be called Standards and Practices, and now they're called Research. And their job is to make the film crew's life miserable. And when I am with a film crew, we do not just wander up somewhere and point a camera at some ruins and say, "Here I am in the ruins of Jaipur," and off I go again. I need to be able to provide two written sources backing up any fact I say on camera. So even though we are wandering around looking for local colour, we are reacting to what we find. We're not necessarily, we don't know where we're going sometimes. They need someone standing in front of the camera who can remember what the Cambridge History of China says about this. And that reduces the pool of available talent quite considerably.
It also means, presumably, that exploration as such is impossible, and you can't actually discover anything. It has to be already printed.
Well, there are loopholes. There are loopholes, and this is where a journalistic mindset comes in. I have to document everything I say. If I can find a local person to say it for me, that counts as local research. And there's a phenomenological thing here, which is that if a Chinese person tells me something is true, it must be true. Or at least we can allow them to make that argument, and I can then argue with them, and it becomes a discourse. So it's really, as an outside observer, I need facts. But if I want to document what someone says, that's different.
You, like I, have managed to make a career as between travel and history, and also to write history outside academia. You don't have an academic job, or have you been an academic historian at any point?
I have not officially. I mean, technically, I'm a visiting professor at Xi'an Jiaotong University, but that's an honorary position so that they can put their name on my books to make their department look good. I don't have to teach history academically, although I do have a doctorate in history.
A doctorate in?
It's in industrial history, actually.
Industrial history. And has that appeared in your writing? Or?
Yes, in fact, my PhD was published as a book called Anime, A History. It's about the Japanese animation business over the last 100 years. But there's no travel in that, because you have to be completely divorced from any kind of local colour. So I was unable to have the fun that I have, which is, I've recently developed this fetish for beginning every chapter with an account of me kind of travelling to the place where something happened. And I picked that up from a writer called Matthew Sweet, who does this kind of thing all the time with his histories of the film business in England in the early 20th century, and also a book about the Victorians, where he kind of wanders London and sees all the evidence that's still there today. And so I thought that was a really cool idea. So I started doing that, and it split my first readers quite dramatically. My publisher loves it. He says, this is the best bit of the book, with you actually going there and seeing what's left. My agent hates it. She says, this ruins your book completely. It's just wasting everybody's time with all this nonsense about travel. So she actually wanted me to take it out of the book before I delivered it to the publisher. And I said, well, let's let the publisher decide on this and see where we end up. So sometimes my travel material was almost edited out.
Do you want to read it? I think you've selected one of those travel sections to read.
Okay, yeah, all right. I will do, you can have Japan or you can have Brixton.
Let's take a popular vote. Who wants Brixton?
Yes.
Who wants Japan?
Thank you, Brixton posse.
Japan wins.
All right. I'm telling you, Brixton's much more fun. You've got much better taste.
We'll get that reading by introducing it differently later.
Yes. Who wants Brixton? And so this is from a book called Christ's Samurai, which is about the persecution of the Christians in Japan in the 17th century, when they were taken away and tortured to make them recant their faith by the samurai. At first, it seems like a completely normal mountain village. The road winds through the centre of town past a couple of shrines, a gift shop, and a plush hotel. But the fog rolls steadily and unceasingly, as if there are chimneys ejecting clouds of steam at ground level, all with the eggy tang of sulphurous gases. Follow a path behind a main street in most parts of Japan, and you will find another street. More houses, a vending machine, but here there is a shocking sight, a desolate, rocky landscape scattered with shallow, bubbling pools. At the edges, scorched yellow grass clings to life, edged by green slimes of algae. This is the point where the red-hot core of Mount Unzen first becomes apparent, a series of boiling lakes and blasted heaths, once regarded by the Japanese as the place where the essence of the Buddhist hells came to the surface. One pool emits a piercing hiss as the steam escapes from the ground nearby. This is the hell of screaming as you fall into the abyss. Another, which bubbles and spatters with a noise like a flock of wheeling birds, is the hell of sparrows. Shortly beyond it is the hell of 10,000 torments. Unzen has attracted visitors for centuries. Some saw it as a place of simple mystery, others as an area touched by divine or demonic power. Despite the attempts of the local authorities to dress it up as a nature sanctuary and an ecological curiosity, there is still an air of deep menace about it. In the Meiji era, a heartbroken local woman supposedly threw herself into one of the pools, sentencing herself to an awful, searing death. As I walk along the wooden decking, I stop by a crag and put my ear close to the warm rock. The earth itself throbs with a steady ka-thump, ka-thump, as if a malevolent heart is beating beneath the ground. A messy spaghetti of water pipes issues forth from one of the volcanic pools, channeling the boiling streams out of the ground and into a nearby hotel, where tourists can bathe in the waters that were once used to boil Christians alive. Linger too long near one of the pools, and a hawker will try and sell you an egg, which she will then shove beneath the ground for a few minutes, boiling it to perfection using nature's own oven. The waters of Unzen have legendary curative properties. Rich in minerals, they were said to cure a variety of skin complaints. That is, of course, assuming they are allowed to cool down a little. At their point of exit from the ground, their temperatures can climb up to 20 degrees above boiling point. Although a place of pilgrimage and healing, Unzen was once also a place of torture.
So would you describe yourself at all as a travel writer, or do you think of yourself as a historian first and foremost?
I would never have described myself as a travel writer in a million years, although recently publishers have come to me and asked me to write books which are more specifically aimed at an audience of travelers rather than an audience of whoever reads history books. I don't know who reads history books. Oh, okay.
History buffs.
Well, for you, an audience for you, as opposed to people who would travel there. Yeah. And I think that's a problem that you face as well, because you've been trying to distance yourself from travel writing for a long time.
Well, I'm not sure that's true. I mean, I certainly, my early books were travel books. And I left university in 1987. At this moment when travel writing was at its most prestigious. There was a special travel writing issue of Granta, and Bill Buford wrote in the introduction, travel writing is the new novel. People are bored of the novel now, but suddenly there's been this crop of books. And he was thinking of Bruce Chatwin's In Patagonia, Patrick Leigh Fermore's Time of Gifts, Jonathan Rayburn's Old Glory. And there was this extraordinary moment in the late 80s when 10, 12, 15 really first-rate writers produced what is still some of the greatest travel books ever written, all within a year or two of each other. It was suddenly the zeitgeist. And coming out of university, I found it was immediately possible to get a publishing contract, which is not something that many writers have the good luck to find. It's usually a terrible struggle to find yourself an agent, and then the agent has a terrible struggle to find a publisher. And I was extremely lucky in my second year at university, having followed Marco Polo's outward route with a university grant. I got a traveling scholarship. I was very lucky. My Cambridge College had a specific grant for medieval historians, and there were only about 10 medieval historians in the entire college. And so, not all of them were going to bother putting in an application. So I found myself with a £750 cheque under my door at the end of the summer term, which in those days was a huge sum of money. I'd never had a cheque like this in my life before, and set off following Marco Polo. And the result was this book in Xanadu, which I published the year after I left college. And after that, I went to Delhi as a young foreign correspondent and wrote a book called City of Jinns, which was about this period of my life living in Delhi. And you yourself have just been writing books on Beijing and Tokyo. And as you'll know, it's a very difficult thing to structure a book around a city because it's such an amorphous beast. It's one thing to go on a journey following the monsoon. You start in Trivandrum and you end in the northeast. Or following Marco Polo, you start in Venice and you end in Xanadu. But with a city, it's a living, breathing organism. And many different writers have had different ways of doing it, whether it's Jan Morris doing Venice and lots of tiny little snapshot, almost postcard chapters. Geoffrey Morehouse writing about Calcutta as this sort of extraordinary city on the edge of a revolution. Or here, Suketu Mehta's fantastic book, Maximum City, which, for my mind, is the great masterpiece among the Indian writers of my generation, certainly in non-fiction. Anyone that hasn't read Maximum City, go straight to the bookshop and just buy a copy now. So I had to find a way to do Delhi. And I came up with the idea of Delhi as what I loved about Delhi was the way that the past was present. And just driving down the center of Delhi through Lodi Gardens, these tombs, these sultanate buildings, just impose themselves in the way of of walkers in the garden or golfers in the golf course. They sit on top of road junctions and under flyovers. They become homes for refugees, whether Afghans or landless Biharis. And what I also realized was that there were sort of fragments of different centuries of the city still alive. So in the Lodi Gardens, you would see the old colonels from partition era with their sort of slightly English accent and tweed jackets. In the old city, you'd find the old calligraphers wearing Mughal frock coats with kabutabars, playing with their pigeons as Babur once did. In the Zamuddin, you would find Sufis singing qawwalis written by Amir Khusro in the 13th century, celebrating a vision of mysticism that was universal to all, that first came in this terribly troubled period when Islam and Hinduism first clashed together in the plains of Delhi. Before that, at Nigambod Ghat, where the Vedas and the Puranas are meant to have risen out of the Yamuna, there's still sadhus reciting their Sanskrit slokas. So, as I saw it, not only was this a city which was full of the ruins of the past, there were living fragments of it who you could go and talk to and interview and get perspectives from different periods of its history in the present. So I went backwards layer by layer as the year went on, like it was sort of peeling an onion until you got back into its heart. And then I wrote my third book, which I think of all my travel books is the one I'm most proud of, though it's the one that's least read here because it's not about India. It's a book about the Middle East and the Christians in the Middle East called From the Holy Mountain. And this book is in a sense, it records a world that no longer exists. To a certain extent, the world I wrote about, the description I have of Delhi, which was 1990, is an utterly different city to the Delhi of today. That was a city of 1 million. Today, if you include Gurgaon and Faridabad and Okhla, it's 26 million. It's the largest urban area on Earth after Greater Tokyo, seen from the sky. It's never written up in the books as such because it's politically split between Haryana, Delhi, and UP. But as an item of human construction seen from space, it's the second biggest urban area in the world. And bigger than Bombay now. So just as that Delhi, in a sense, has turned to history, and the Delhi that I wrote on, in many ways, is no longer there. Even more, the Christian Middle East I wrote about in the late 1980s, mid-1990s, has been utterly destroyed today. And the Christian communities that I write about in Aleppo are no longer there. Many are dead, many are in exile, in refugee camps in the Bekaa Valley or in Jordan. The Armenians have gone to Armenia. And it's now become a sort of historical record. And it's very odd, as one of the kind of odd avuncular pleasures of being a middle-aged travel writer, is that already, I'm only 50, I can see my books turning in, I wrote them as works of travel, but they become works of history, in a sense.
Can we have a reading from this? You want a reading, don't you? From William Dalrymple? Yeah. No, we don't. We don't want a reading. We're not interested. Oh, no, sorry. I think they're ready.
So this is a little passage from visiting. What I was doing in this book was following the route of a 6th century monk who was himself, in some ways, a travel writer. He was called John Moschus. And he did a journey recording, as he saw it, the sayings and stories and anecdotes of the Desert Fathers. This was a period when, rather like in medieval India, Sufis would be found on the edge of every city, and sadhus could be found beside every river, in their hermitages in the Himalayas and so on. In the Middle East, in the 6th century, was the huge time when the Middle East was the center of Christianity. Today we think of Christianity as a Western religion. But of course it's as much an Eastern religion as Hinduism or Judaism or Buddhism or Islam. It was born in Jerusalem. It received its intellectual superstructure in Alexandria and Damascus and Istanbul, Constantinople. And the period of John Moschus, the whole of these deserts were filled with refugees from the crumbling Byzantine Roman cities that were falling into decay. And John Moskos goes around talking to these saints, strange hermits in caves and mountainsides, these stylites who stood on top of pillars, praying in a sort of crazy way from the top of a pillar. And what he didn't know was he was recording a world on the edge of extinction, because he was an exact contemporary of the Prophet Muhammad. And a generation after he put this account of this journey, the Caliph Omar swept up from the Hejaz and conquered the Byzantine Middle East, so that the whole of what is now Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria became overnight the center of the Islamic world. And these Christian minorities began to dwindle down to the 10% they were at the beginning of the 20th century, then down to the 5% they were when I was doing this journey in the late 90s, and now they're only 2%. And some places I would go in John Moskos's footsteps and just find ruins in the sand. At other places, I would find fully functioning monasteries. And this passage, which I'm going to read, was in the monastery of Marsaba, which is on the west bank beyond Bethlehem, filled with rather crazy and wonderful Greek monks. And my favorite of all was the guest master, Father Theophanes, who'd been a policeman in Athens before taking the habit and becoming a monk. "Look at it," said Father Theophanes, the monastery's tall, gaunt guest master, waving at the dark, rocky gorge beneath us. "There it is, the valley of doom, the valley of dreadful judgment." Below us, the monastic buildings of Marsaba fell away in a ripple of chapels, cells, and oratories, each successive layer hanging like a wasp's nest from a ledge on the rock face. Opposite, the cliff wall had turned an almost unnatural shade of red in the light of the evening. The rock was pitted with caves, each formerly the cell of a Byzantine monk. All were now deserted. "It's very beautiful," I said. "Beautiful?" said Father Theophanes, rustling his robes in horror. "Beautiful? See down there at the bottom of the river. Nowadays, that's just sewage from Jerusalem. But on Judgment Day, that's where the river of blood is going to flow. It's going to be full of Freemasons, whores and heretics, Protestants, schismatics, Jews and Catholics. More ouzo, please." The monk poured a thimbleful of spirit into a small glass, and when I gulped it down, he continued with his apocalypse. "At the head of the damned will be a troop composed of all the popes of Rome, followed by their deputies, the vice presidents of the Freemasons." You're saying the Pope is a Freemason? A Freemason, he's the president of the Freemasons. Everyone knows this. Each morning he worships the devil in the form of a naked woman with the head of a goat. "Actually," I said, "I'm a Catholic." "Then," said Father Theophanes, "unless you convert to orthodoxy, you too will follow your Pope down that valley through the scorching fire. We will watch you from this balcony," he added. "But of course it'll be too late then to save you." I smiled, but Father Theophanes was in full swing and clearly in no mood for joking. "No one can truly know what that day will be like," he said, shaking his head gravely. "But some of our Orthodox fathers have had visions. Fire, fire that will never end, terrible, terrible fire will come from the throne of Christ, just like it does on the icons. The saints, those who are to be saved, in other words, the Orthodox Church, will fly through the air to meet Christ. But sinners and all non-Orthodox will be separated from the elect. The damned will be pushed and prodded by devils down through the fire, down the valley of Josaphat, past exactly the route those Israeli hikers took an hour ago, down, down to the mouth of hell." "Is that nearby?" I asked. "Certainly," said Father Theophanes, stroking his beard. "The mouth of hell will open up near the Dead Sea." "Is that in the Bible?" I asked. "Of course," said Father Theophanes. "Everything I'm telling you is true." Just a little coda to that reading. After a week with Father Theophanes, I finally plucked up the courage to ask him why he was so obsessed with Freemasons. "Freemasons?" he said. "Freemasons? They are the legions of the Antichrist, the stormtroopers of the whore of Babylon." But I always thought Freemasons these days just had coffee mornings and bridge evenings and that sort of thing. "Bridge evenings," said Father Theophanes, pronouncing the word as if it was some sort of satanic ritual. "Probably this bridge evening also. But their main activity is to worship the devil. There are many steps," he said, nodding knowingly. "But the final step is to meet with the devil and have homosexual relations with him. After this, he makes you Pope, or sometimes President of the United States. President, I said, of the United States? Certainly, he said. This has been proved. All of the presidents of the United States have been Freemasons, except Kennedy. And you know what happened to him.
I really loved that book. I really did. Can I ask, this is not exactly travel writing, but I'm just curious. You spend half your year in India, half your year in the UK. How Indian do you feel and how British do you feel?
Thank you, Shreya. So now I spend most of my year here. I spend 9 to 10 months here, and I just leave for the monsoon because I hate rain. Quite honestly. I hate nothing. I actually came back this year in July to sit in my farm, and I sat there miserably in my little writing studio, watching the floods rising around me, and thinking how much I wanted, for the only time of year I prefer to be in Scotland. So I don't know. I mean, it's much easier, I think, to be someone coming into Britain and become British than it is to be someone coming into India and become Indian. I love this country. I've chosen to live here for 30 years. Most of my books have been about this country. I'm obsessed about this country, and it has accommodated me and allowed me to be many different things: a festival organizer, a historian, an art historian, all sorts of things, a foreign correspondent. But I think ultimately you can't become an Indian, even if you're one of the very rare Farangs who actually take Indian citizenship, which they normally do for property reasons, because you can't own property without citizenship. You still, however good your Hindi, however deep your roots, you are not an Indian. People will look on you as a foreigner. So I am both an insider and an outsider, and that socially can be unsettling. But as a writer, it's an asset, because you have both the curiosity and surprise of the outsider, and you see things that the native cannot see. For me, when I go to London, the red buses and the pillar boxes are invisible. They're just the wallpaper of my life. They're nothing special. But someone coming in immediately spots the shape of a London taxi or a pillar box. They can see the oddities of something that's very specifically London or very specifically British. I still am constantly and daily surprised by this country, because it's not where I grew up, and every day there is something which I don't understand and want to know more about. And yet, after 30 years, I do know my way around, and I know the history. And so I think as a writer, it's a very, very useful thing. And you can constantly spot subjects that Indian writers don't write about, because in a sense it wouldn't occur to them to write about it. So I think it's a great asset, but it can be uncomfortable, and I would love, in a sense, to feel that I could say I was Indian, but I don't think even on my deathbed, if I'm here right up until my dying day, that I actually will be Indian. It's not. I mean, I thought a lot about this, and it's a sadness actually.
Yeah. Tell me about your farm.
So yes, I mean, I used to live in Nizamuddin and in the center of Delhi. Before that, I lived in Majnu-Katila, the Tibetan colony in the far north. And I've been, Delhi historically has migrated northwards. It started in Lalkot, through Siri, Purana Raikitola, Tughlakabad, Purana Kila, up to Shah Jahanabad. My journey through Delhi over 30 years has been southwards. I started in Majnu-Katila, headed through Nizamuddin, and now live on the very far south, just on the Haryana border, where I hire and rent a wonderful little farm from the family that owned the Imperial Hotel. And unusually for a Delhi farm, it actually is a farm. We ploughed up the lawns and have a huge vegetable garden. From November through till April, we're totally self-sufficient in vegetables. I have goats that provide both meat and milk and yogurt. And my wife is a painter. She's here at a different session today. And we both work in the house. And it's a very good location in that if you want distraction and you can join in the run of Delhi book launches and parties and dinners and so on. But it's a completely self-sufficient little bubble that when you need to work hard, you can totally lock yourself away in. and it's been this particular farm has been my home for 15 years now, and it's a wonderful place.
There's a great book to be written, My Indian Farm, is there not? That's got to happen one day.
Yes, I think
like a year in Provence, but without the Frenchness.
But with goats.
With goats. I think one thing we should talk about before opening this to the audience is process. I'm sure the audience contains people who travel and would like maybe to write travel books, whether articles of the sort that you've made your living doing or books of the sort you, Jonathan, and I've done. Just to talk, maybe Alexander first. What was your when you go on work to write a travel article or to write a travel book? Do you keep a diary at the end of the day? What's your process, and how do you write afterwards?
I took advice from Paul Theroux, actually, who said when I'm traveling, I take notes during the day, and then every evening, before I've had a drink, I write the day up as accurately, almost pitch perfect, ready for the publisher. And that's what I try and consistently fail to do. But in terms of process, I mean, anybody young, or you don't have to be young to start being a travel writer. Anybody who wants to do it, just carry a pen, carry a notebook, and keep your eyes open. Notice things, listen to people, watch people, spy on them. And all kinds of things emerge, and you'll come up with some great stuff. And then you put it down on paper, and you read it through next morning, and you think, that's not bad. That's the way to start.
And writing it up afterwards? What's your
writing it? Well, yes. I mean, well, I try and write it up afterwards. But as I mentioned earlier, when I got back from my Indian trip, first of all, I missed India terribly, and I missed traveling around India terribly. Meanwhile, I had scores of notebooks and press clippings. I'd read all the journals. I'd read all the recommended books. And all this material was sort of sitting there looking at me and saying, well, what are you going to do with me? And getting the first paragraph took 3 months. And that's writer's block. But it's not really writer's block, it's getting your book started block. And once that was out of the way, I was fine.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Jonathan?
My process is not dissimilar, but I don't wait. I don't wait to start drinking. I actually do start drinking before it begins. This has evolved as it's not a process that I was planning, and certainly I never met Paul Theroux to tell me how to do it. But I have an accidental first readership of about 20 people. It started off with a letter a day to my mother. Just an email a day about what kind of horrible nonsense goes on in my life. And that's expanded to include other members of my family, a few interested friends, and my agent. And I tend to write, I mean, if I'm ever traveling, I try to write home every day, and I just send out this kind of round-robin email to them about what's happened. And when I came to India, I said, I won't be writing to you from India. I've got nothing to say about it. And I've sent 1,000 words back every day about what's been happening to me and what I've been reading and who I've met and things. And this is really only for a local audience, but you do find yourself, because you know someone will read it, and it may well escape from this small loop of people. My agent does occasionally send my emails to publishers and go, oh, look what happened to him today. Maybe you should buy that. But you do try and plan a little bit more. You do try and create a degree of structure before you send it. It's not just a list of what you had for dinner and a picture of your cat. It's actually something more considered. And then what this means is that, for example, I've been living in China for 3 or 4 months every year for the last 5 years. And so in the process of just sending an email home every day, I've generated 350,000 words in one long indexed Word file, which is searchable. So now, if I need to, say, write about the time when I went to a rice paddy collecting, you know, because this includes the times that I'm filming with the film crew, of course. So if I want to write about rice paddies, if I want to write about the time I went to a tea plantation, if I want to remember what statue I saw in Turufan, it's a searchable document with the kind of things that you forget, these little tiny, minute details. I was reading Alexander's book this morning about the traveling on the Imperial airline, and one of the things that he recalls as he goes through customs on the first part of the trip, is the man who searched him had little dots of shaving cream by his ears. And it's just such a lovely little moment of kind of human focus. It'd be very difficult to catch on film, but you know, I feel for that immigration inspector and the rush that he had out of his bathroom that morning. And we're not even out of Heathrow at this point. And we've still got, 40 places to go. And those kind of details are things that will slip your mind if you don't write them down immediately. And I think it's an important part of the travel writer's process, even if you don't touch that material for 5 years.
I totally agree. And for me, the key is, the mistake I made is that quite a lot of travel books for example, Robert Byron's Road to Oxiana, which is one of my favorite, talk about writing a logbook. And when I first did my long journeys, I used to do that thing in the evening of sitting with a pen, with quite a formal, nice papyrus notebook, trying to write good travel prose. And inevitably, if you're on a journey, particularly in uncomfortable parts of the world, and on a low budget, you're exhausted. And you've just come off a 8-hour bus journey, whatever it is, and you're somewhere grubby and you haven't had time to have a shower yet. And it just didn't work. And what I learned from that first journey was you had to have in your hand a notebook to record immediate details, the bit of shaving foam behind your ear, which might disappear out of your head in 3 seconds if you haven't got it down. The conversations, the exact dialogue that takes place with the customs official.
Things you overhear people saying.
Things you overhear people saying. And the effect that a place has on you and your body, the feeling of dirt between your toes, or a dry mouth, or the smell of a place, a particular scent from a tree. These things are very fleeting. And unless you get them down, you end up not remembering them and making up stuff instead, which immediately begins to the temptation to falsify.
Yeah, I think there's been a degree of controversy recently about Patrick Leigh Fermor, and he made a trip across Europe, 50 years ago or something, and shortly before he died, he kind of wrote it up. And there's this idea that where he didn't take any notes. How does he remember what the weather was like on the 16th of December, 1947?
I think it's very important. I think you have got to be closer to your National Geographic than your documentary crew.
But actually,
the truth does matter, and it's not just that a moral matter. It's also what you make up will never be quite as convincing as what is actually true. The true dialogue will always ring more true than the made-up dialogue or the slightly spun dialogue. And I think you have got to be very disciplined in A, getting it down, and B, then not elaborating it beyond what you can actually remember. One final thing before we open up for questions, we're just about to run out of time, is the future of travel writing. We had that Jonathan Raban quote, the world is a suburb or not. Does travel writing have a future? Is the world no longer interesting? Has the internet destroyed our trade? Or is it still a fascinating place, and does travel writing have a future? Jonathan?
I think it's certainly harder to find old-fashioned original topics. I was in Yunnan trying to film a remote tribe last month, and we traveled for 2 days through the mountains, and when we got there was a coach party of 100 Chinese photographers who had also made the journey to document this dying tradition, which really made our life difficult. But I think whenever you travel with yourself, and you are an interesting person, and your encounters will be different. Some of my favourite bits of work have actually been things about me travelling in my own country, which you think would be completely over-documented by now, but I think there's still always something new to say, and still readers who want to read it.
Alexander?
I was just very, very quickly. I think we're sort of travel writing. There's still a place for travel writers, but it's become, our world has become miniaturized. I had an idea years ago to go around the Ring of Fire, around the volcanic area of the Pacific Ocean, a huge undertaking, and I kept putting it off. What I should have done was just focused on one particular volcano and one community, and that would have produced probably a much better book.
Ladies and gentlemen, we're running out of time now, but just a couple of minutes for a couple of questions. Front row, straight away. How long have we got? 5 minutes.
William, two of your books, The City of Gins and The 9 Lives. So I found a difference in the way you approach both the books. The City of Jinns is more about your personal narrative, your personal anecdotes, and Nine Lives is more about you emphasizing on the stories of those 9 people. So what is the William Dalrymple way of approaching a particular story? When do you realize that you have to abstain yourself out of the story and emphasize more on the narrative of that particular person or story?
It's a choice you make. City of Jinns is very self-consciously a memoir of living in Delhi at that particular moment. The same is true of In Xanadu. It's about me going on this trip, all from the Holy Mountain. But I felt very strongly that when you're dealing with Indian religion, it shouldn't, it's not about my spiritual journey. What I was interested in recording was what it means to be a Devdasi or a Jain nun starving yourself to death in Salikana, or to be a Papuji ki Fad Bopa performing the Papuji ki Fad, or to be a Baul living today in living in Bengal. And so I made a conscious decision to keep myself out of it as far as possible from the text, and to make it in their voice, accurately recording their conversations, and for each of these individuals to tell their stories. But there are many ways to write a travel book, and every travel writer makes a series of decisions of how they're going to do it. Is it right or wrong?
I think that one decision is to ask yourself, how big will your name be on the cover if this becomes a book? And the bigger your name is on the cover, the more likelihood that you as a character are going to be part of this narrative. So if you are a travel superstar and your presence in the story is of interest to the reader because of who you are, then that's great. If, however, you're like me and you're quite a minor figure and people don't buy your books because of who you are, they buy your books because of what the subject is, then I think it becomes much more of a better idea to move yourself as far away from the narrative as possible and write about the people and the place rather than yourself in it.
One last quick question. This gentleman, second row.
Well, I'd just like to say I'm a really big fan of Return of the King.
Thank you.
So have you ever considered writing about the second or third Afghan wars?
So Return of a King is my last book. It's not a travel book, it's a history book, the story of the first Afghan war, the famous occasion when, at least in legend, an army marched into Afghanistan and one man came out. And no, I would love to write more about Afghanistan. The second and third Afghan wars are less perfect stories. There is a wonderful narrative arc in the first one. It is the ultimate tale of imperial hubris. And even if it wasn't literally true that one man came out alive, an entire army was destroyed. And in a time when Western nations are interfering in this part of the world again and sending troops out, I felt it was very important to tell that story. But I've got 2 books bubbling at the moment. One completed, coming out next week, on the Koh-i-Noor diamond, which I first discovered while researching Return of a King, and some of the 2 stories overlap. And there's a bit more Afghanistan in this book now. And the next big book, which I'm writing at the moment, will be out in about 18 months, I hope, is the story of how the East India Company conquered India. How it was that a corporation, people still talk about the British conquering India, it wasn't. It was much more sinister. It's a multinational corporation. A faceless multinational corporation controlled from a boardroom in London with investors, many of whom were Indian, incidentally. How that corporation took over a country, it seems to me to be even more relevant now in the time of Trump than it ever was before. And in a world where, here with the Adanis and all the influence of multinationals and reliance on governments or not, these are important questions for today. And with history, I always like to write history which can reflect on the present.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen.